Welcome to the American Academy. Welcome to our evening with Professor Jill Lepore. My name is John Kornblum. I'm a trustee of the Academy and sort of a fixture around here, and I'm very pleased to be able to be your host this evening. We have this evening a great pleasure and opportunity, both because of the subject which Professor Lepore is talking about, but also because of Professor Lepore, who is truly an interesting and captivating person. She has written 12 books in about, what, 3 years? 2 years? Something like that. But from all kinds of things, from Wonder Woman, one of the big sellers, which we unfortunately don't have available this evening, to things about a New York City fire and witchcraft and all sorts of things. But she has now decided that she's had to get serious. So she's written a 900-page something or other history of the United States. Now I have a little bit of a problem with her title here. It's called From the Beginning to the End. Now I'm not sure if she means she's going to tell us about the end or if this is just as far as she's gotten. But anyway, it's been a book which has been extremely well reviewed, which is clearly a very insightful picture into an America that you don't always see, and we're very pleased, Professor Lepore, that you've come. I've read a bit about her and about her writing, and I would just quote one sentence of which I found in the magazine about the book which she's going to talk about this evening. It'll give you a sense of what we can expect. It says, she has assembled evidence of an America that was better than some thought, worse than almost everyone imagined, and weirder than most history books convey. So here we are, the good, bad, and the weird. Jill, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much for that very apt introduction. I am a weird scholar, so I'm happy to have the work described as such. It's really a delight to be here with all of you and at the beautiful Academy that's been our host for these last couple of days. It's a real privilege to be in a place of such noble intention. I have indeed written a very long book of American history, and we have a short hour here this evening. So I'm determined to cover it all in an hour. So brace yourselves. But I do want to say I have a device to help us get through this entire history, a few centuries, in just a matter of moments. But I do want to say that I wrote a long book on purpose because we happen to live in a world, although I wrote this book, began it a number of years ago, in which most historical argument is reduced to four-word slogans. This is a historical argument. It's just a very brief one. So is this. So on both the right and the left, we make arguments about the relationship between the past and the present all the time by way of political slogans. That's how the parties in their polarized form work in the United States today. Protesters of the Obama campaign and the Obama presidency portrayed Obama's campaign as a betrayal of the past, of the greatness of the era of George Washington. On the other hand, the Obama campaign portrayed itself as the promise of the future, and even the way that we talk about our parties, the Conservative Party urging Americans to look backward and our Progressive Party urging us to look forward, embodies these two very polarized ways of understanding change over time. So if the Obama campaign called for change, the Tea Party movement called to stop change, just as significantly as empty a promise. We could think about the very small movement to impeach Obama, but calls by some on the very far right for Obama's impeachment, having been answered by a much larger swell of American sentiment urging the impeachment in a politics of extremes that now dominates the American political landscape. This is the one slogan that I find myself in greatest sympathy with. Hope all of you who are not Native American speakers get this slang. In other words, the kind of historical ventriloquism that often characterizes American contemporary political discourse is pretty disquieting to a historian. I find it really weird that we're asked to know, we wonder what George Washington might think about our affordable health care plan, for instance, or about our policy with regard to Europe. So I set about writing a long history because I wanted to ask us to set aside a kind of Twitter-length understanding of the present and of the past, and sort of specifically to say, do you know what it really takes to understand history? It actually takes dedicating yourselves to reading 1,000 pages. So I stand by that. On the other hand, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures this evening, each of which I would argue represents an idea of America. Because we live in a world, we are part of a species, it is an element of the human condition that we have a natural tendency to want to understand ourselves in place. We want to understand who we are as human beings on this earth, that all peoples throughout all times back to the first, very earliest cave paintings involve a representation like this Aztec Codex, where this man in the middle is kind of searching his way through what we would think of as the four corners, the four directions of the compass. That we are all searching our way through the world, and we have a tendency to represent our progress through the world, our place in the world graphically. That it is a very beautiful way to represent the idea of belonging, the idea of our origins, and even our sense in history. So I want to take, beginning with this image, these representations of place that have to do with the place that became eventually the United States, and how we can examine those to tell us something about the long history of the United States. I will say, I don't think any of these images are actually in the book. This is a non-book talk, book talk. I'm going to start here, though, and pause for a minute over this image that's known as Powhatan's mantle. It's actually in a museum in Oxford. It's 4 deerskin hides stitched together and embroidered with tiny little shells. Powhatan was an Algonquin sachem, a leader of the Algonquin people. He was the father of Pocahontas. And this is allegedly a cloak that he wore that was a symbol of his rule. Here's Powhatan in the center with, to his left and his right, the animal guides, his spirit guides. And each of these circles is a village that pays tribute to Powhatan. So in a way, this is both a cosmological representation of America before Europeans came to call it America, of Powhatan's world, but it's also a map of his rule, right? This is a political map. It is an instantiation of Powhatan's political authority. Europeans in this same era tended to represent the world this way. This is the first map of the world ever printed in the West. It is printed in Germany in 1472 from a map that was first drawn in the 7th century. So it represents the very long medieval world's, Christian world's depiction of the world as divided into 3 parts: Asia, Europe, and Africa, with the Mediterranean in the middle, surrounded by an ocean and populated by the three sons of Noah. It's a Christian view of the world. It's a T for the Trinity and an O for the unity of the medieval Christian worldview. It's not really a geographical map. It's a cosmological map, in the way that Powhatan's map is also a cosmological map. You may not know, but the German map maker Martin Waldseemüller was the first person to call this body of land over here, found by the Europeans for the first time in 1492, America. Waldseemüller made this giant map of the world. It's bigger than this wall. It's 12 sheets glued together like wallpaper. And he was trying to offer up the most accurate possible representation of the globe, including down to the very late-breaking news of the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope, and he kind of added in at the last minute. And he didn't really know what to do with this blob. Nobody really knew what it looked like. Nobody in Europe knew what it looked like. And he didn't know what to call it, but it was important to put it there. But he was celebrating here both the Greek mathematician Ptolemy, from whom he had learned the ability to render a globe on a flat surface, and Amerigo Vespucci, whose book, The New World, had just been translated into German, and Waldseemüller had read it. And so in honor of Vespucci, who called this thing the New World, and everyone else called it the fourth part of the world, Waldseemüller decided to call it America. And just that name happened to stick, is the only reason that the United States of America and North and South America take that name, because of this one odd map. But it meant that Vespucci himself, here he appears here in this Dutch engraving from about the year 1600, became a kind of icon for Europe and for the Europe of the Age of Discovery. So I think if you look here, I often think of Amerigo Vespucci as the Harvey Weinstein of the Age of Discovery. It's a super troubling image, as you will closely observe. Vespucci is not just a waking, sleeping America, but this is, of course, it's an image of rape. It's a celebration of the European rape of America, America depicted here as this naked indigenous woman who's prone while Vespucci is standing. And if you divide this engraving along a diagonal, you'll see that everything over here is supposed to represent the greatness and superiority of Europe, its religion, its technology, the sextant, the cross, the ships, and everything over here is supposed to represent the beauty and lushness and fertility, but primitiveness, and specifically the heathenness of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This representation of cannibalism back here, that's a little bit hard to see, but there's a leg, human leg roasting on spit, it's a focal point of the image because it's the fiction that these people engage in cannibalism that provides the legal rationale, the very shaky legal rationale under which Europeans claimed native lands during what Europeans call the Age of Discovery. There's a whole bunch of ways in which Europeans made those claims visually. Here's Queen Elizabeth. You notice where she's resting her hand? She has her hand right on top of North America, as if to say, this is now mine, or this is ours. Wouldn't she say, this is ours? She's a queen. But remember, England has no colonies in 1588. This is just a fiction, too. These, like Amerigo Vespucci Awakens America, these are fantasies about Europeans' vision of America, which involved the rape and conquest of the Americans. By 1754, the Americans themselves that is to say, the European colonists who are just beginning to think of themselves as Americans, are deeply influenced by this image that is printed in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper that represents the colonies as being artificially separated. Here's New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, all the way down to South Carolina. Franklin urging that they unify for their common defense. This is, of course, a political cartoon, but it's important also to think about it as a map with just the Atlantic Ocean over here. It really is a map, and one way to think about it is that jigsaw puzzles themselves were invented by map makers in this era. As a way, here's one of the very first jigsaw puzzles Europe divided into its kingdom, as a way to teach people that these boundaries between nation states were real things. Of course, these are fictions. Someone just imagined this line. They fought over this line. But jigsaw puzzles were actually part of how Europeans came to understand their own national boundaries, and especially their claims as colonial powers to lands in other parts of the world on which they also drew fictional lines and called them real. So this jigsaw puzzle, this is a jigsaw puzzle map as much as anything else. By the time of the American Revolution, the depiction of America as a naked indigenous woman has become commonplace. Also, here she is again being raped as a really common element of the graphic arts. Here, America is being raped by British tax collectors. So now Americans representing themselves as identifying as Americans here with the allegorical figure of America. You could think of the American Constitution from 1787 as a kind of map of the world that represents the people and their existence in place. It's a kind of chart, it's a charter or a chart, has that same function. After the founding of the new republic, though, the United States was immediately subject to criticism, the criticism that is offered in this beautiful painting, which you can also divide along a diagonal. And here, America has been reborn as liberty. Just another allegorical figure now with Europeanized features and the liberty cap, and she's dressed. And here on the liberty side are all the great things that come with liberty: knowledge, the arts and sciences, the beauty and knowledge of antiquity, a sense of a place in the world. And everything on the right represents the abjection and the atrocity and the suffering of slavery. And this figure right here, this African-American woman with the kerchief, is the analog to liberty. If this is the allegory for liberty, she is the allegory for slavery, and she's all over early American graphic arts, including this political cartoon from 1804 when Thomas Jefferson was running for re-election, here indicted as the philosophic cock. That usually gets more of a laugh. Maybe this yeah, so there's Thomas Jefferson, and here's Sally Hemings. The woman who was a half-sister of his wife, of his dead wife, who was the mother of 6 of his children, and who he claimed as his human property. Hemmings is here represented as the allegorical figure, that same figure that we just saw, the allegory of slavery, right? This is an indictment. This is a reason people shouldn't vote for Thomas Jefferson. It's a political cartoon during an election year. That indictment is a source of continuous expression, as indeed the failure of the United States to end slavery was the failure of its constitutional order, and was subject to constant debate, of course, which would lead the nation to civil war in just a few years' time. But here in 1848, at the end of the war with Mexico, is an allegory of the United States as a hotel. It's called it's a little hard to read, but it says the American Hotel up here. There's an eagle. And in many ways, this is an image that is a celebration of the democratization of American politics. At the founding, all white men could not vote. You had to pay taxes or own property, had to demonstrate some capacity. But by 1848, all white men, everybody on this porch, is eligible to vote, and therefore is taking an active political interest in the war news from Mexico, which is being read by this guy. It's a little hard for us to see now, but this is a portrait of diversity. This is meant as, and you would, if you've seen it in 1848, wow, all those guys are in the same hotel. They're rich, they're poor, they're city folk, they're country folk. This guy looks Irish, they're immigrant, they're old, they're young. It's an incredible celebration of American democracy and needs to, I think, be celebrated as such. But there's also something unsettling about this celebration. There's all these little clues. Like one is the porch is rotting. Up here, if you can see that. Another is this a slightly obscure figure leaning out the window is a woman, a white woman. 1848 is the year American women for the first time demanded the right to vote. She's trying to hear the news because she would like to be on that porch. And then there are these figures in the front, this black man and presumably his child dressed in rags, indicating that they are enslaved people. And they are not allowed on the porch either, but they too are, of course, this war news from Mexico is going to affect them more than anyone else. And the sneakiest thing here, these figures are the ones in red, white, and blue. By the 1850s, as the nation's beginning to unravel over the question of slavery, we see for the first time images like this, which are familiar to you if you follow American presidential elections. This is a political map that depicts the states that have abolished slavery in red, so newly California enters the Union in 1850 as a free state. The slaves that the states that practice slavery in gray, and then the slaves that have either not yet decided or have not yet entered the Union in green. But Americans came to really picture themselves, picture the country this way, picture themselves this way, as fundamentally divided, as of course indeed they were, over the question of holding other people in bondage. 1863, of course, is the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a photograph, this is the first photograph I've shown you, of Sojourner Truth, the great abolitionist. Sojourner Truth is here depicting herself as that icon of slavery now, as a kind of allegory of emancipation. And the way that this photograph, she's transformed herself from an allegory of slavery into an allegory of something very different is, and this is the sneakiest picture I have for you all night long, but she seems to be just knitting like a kind of grandmother. It's sort of cute and innocent. But if you take a look at the skein of yarn, here's the Great Lakes, here's Maine, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. It's a super sneaky photograph. She's not just claiming her freedom and emancipation, celebrating herself and her life, but claiming that African Americans have made America. It's an extraordinarily powerful presentation of self as a claim of citizenship and as a claim of something far more, far deeper and richer even than a claim of freedom or citizenship alone. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War, a new regime of racist ideology took hold in the United States, also in Germany, that would give rise to what we would call social Darwinism, eugenics, in which racial pseudoscience sorted out peoples by race into a very strict racial hierarchy. So here we have liberty, that idolized, allegorical, Europeanized American allegory for liberty, contrasted with the many different, here presented as deformations of womanhood and of the possibility of liberty. Is a really vivid illustration of the rise of highly racialized thinking and its transmission through the American popular culture, including by way of graphic arts, a really deeply disturbing image. You see in the 1870s, as the United States government engages in a campaign of continued wars of aggression against indigenous peoples, the celebration of liberty now often represented as progress. If you see the little train here, by the 1870s, there's a fascination with liberties pairing with progress. Progress is always represented by a train moving across the continent, bringing, this is a depiction of what the artist would have thought of as civilization overrunning savagery. So these incredibly powerfully racist depictions of the European conquest of indigenous lands, which are all kind of seen over by this sort of angelic liberty. The 1880s, which witnessed the rise of Jim Crow segregation, also witnessed the very first immigration restriction laws in the United States, the restriction of the Chinese. This political cartoon is actually an indictment of immigration restriction, in which different immigrant groups from earlier eras of immigration, Germans, Irish, African American, are depicted using walls taken from the Great Wall of China to build a wall on the Pacific border of the United States. But of course, meanwhile, in the East, the Statue of Liberty has been erected as a gift from France to celebrate liberty and immigration, in fact, in New York, eliciting this indictment from an anti-immigration newspaper in California, warning Chinese not to come to the United States. This notion of representing the country as a map, as a map that should be a jigsaw puzzle where children can learn both the boundaries between the states and also the racial order, depicted here with liberty again, and a very diminutive and highly racialized indigenous person, indeterminate sex, being taught what the boundaries of the American states are, is a really bizarre American imperialist image from the 1880s. We could look, if we wanted to, for earlier representations of all manner of contemporary political resonance in moments. This is a not uncommon representation of populism in the 19th century, when Eastern magazines used to make fun of populists who were generally from the West. This is representing populism as a hot air balloon, a balloon full of hot air, put together of various patches, patched together ideas. So it's a kind of demeaning of the people. There's also the indictment of monopolists that is very much part of our political discourse today, our anti-corporation discourse from the left. This guy is about to grab the piggy bank of this tiny little toddler. We see that figure of liberty or America is still absolutely with us, but she was recycled by suffragists in the 19-teens. Here she is, liberty trapped by man's tyranny. She's tied up in the bonds of womanhood, trying to escape those bonds. By the 19-teens, you see images of the United States that look like this. This is a photograph of Henry Ford's motor plant in Michigan, but it's also a very disturbing, at once sort of celebration of mass production and the engine of the American economy, but also just a very unsettling representation of mass society. And you see a manifestation of that concern, especially the concern about the masses as a whole, made manifest in the arguments on behalf of immigration restriction in the 1920s. We talk a lot about the wall, but we don't talk about the funnel, but they did talk about the funnel in the 1920s before the passage of the National Origins Act of great immigration restriction, restricting immigration from Europe on the basis basically of eugenics arguments. Only Northern Europeans could come, Southern Europeans could not. That's what the funnel is meant to be doing. I would put forward that Amerigo Vespucci and America or Liberty make their way into American comic books with Captain America. Here is Vespucci in 1940, and Wonder Woman, a kind of recycled version of Liberty in 1941. But it's said that during the Second World War, this is the year of the Atlantic Charter, that the United States begins to think about itself as a superpower, especially relative to Europe. And FDR in particular thinks of himself as leading the free the free world, or imagining a post-war order in which the United States leads the free world. At the same time, of course, the regime of racial segregation that is instituted after the Civil War, the Jim Crow segregation, has not been dismantled, has been the subject of extraordinary efforts on the part of African-American activists and a civil rights movement that is much longer than most Americans think. But it is led by now to the greatest migration in American history, in which African-Americans leave the Jim Crow South and go to cities, especially in the Midwest and in the West, in California, seeking freedom and an escape from vigilante terrorism. This is one of a series of paintings by the African-American artist Jacob Lawrence depicting that migration, and I think of it essentially as a map. It's a little bit like that Sojourner Truth photograph to me, in that it's kind of continental in its expansiveness. There's just a sense of the peopling of the continent in this quite beautiful piece of art. Here's a hilarious photograph of FDR in 1942. It's funny to me, maybe because, I don't know, a lot of things are funny to me, but also reminds me of that Queen Elizabeth. Remember when she had her hand, like the imperialism of England in 1588, North America is mine. A very different political figure, Roosevelt, eyeing the world, not with a sense of avarice, but with a capacity that the Americans are bringing to the world that is new. And that is much enhanced by the American military might, and economic might, the production of weapons of war, and also, of course, of our soldiers and sailors during the Second World War, along with the Allied powers. But at the end of that war, of course, the United States will be stronger than ever before, while much of the rest of the world has been devastated by the fighting. That war, though, also led the Allies to develop what will become the general purpose computer. Here's a depiction of a very early general purpose computer that would really transform American life in ways that historians are only beginning to reckon with. It's one of the things I spend a lot of time on in the book, is the history of computing and the history of technologies of communication more broadly. By 1952, for the very first time, here's a very dashing young Walter Cronkite. This is election night. 1952, which is Eisenhower versus Stevenson, is the first election in which the outcome is predicted by computer on election night here at CBS News. They're using a UNIVAC. This isn't actually a UNIVAC. This is a fake UNIVAC. They're just pretending to be using the UNIVAC. They were in New York. The UNIVAC was in Pennsylvania. Couldn't move. It was in Philadelphia. But we were asked, like, where's America in this graphic? It's this printout. Increasingly, in the 1950s, 1950 is the first census calculated with a computer, with this computer, not the fake one, but the real one. And this is the American people here on this printout. Increasingly, we come to be represented in that way as pieces of data. After Sputnik, of course, the United States had a different sense of who shouldered the burden of the world, and here it is MIT computer scientists who are the new atlases in the technology race that in many ways gets us down to our day with its denigration of humanistic knowledge and its strange elevation of technology. There's a critique of what holds Americans together that emerges by the 1960s, I think very beautifully depicted by the artist Jasper Johns here in this map of the United States, in which the states are bleeding into one another. The protest movements of the 1960s that ask all Americans to think about our common ancestors, to think about divisions between Americans, that go back to the very naming of the land on Martin Waldseemüller's map in 1507, indigenous peoples engaging in the American Indian movement and other forms of protest, including the occupation of Alcatraz, the emergence of Chicano studies, African-American studies at American universities, the turn from the civil rights movement to black nationalism, the emergence of the women's rights movement, the blossoming of the gay rights movement that had started in the 1950s. There's all sorts of, there's a kind of political explosion in the 1960s, which includes student protests, but is largely focused on the Vietnam War. Begins the era of our modern polarization, in which the nation's very symbols themselves are fodder for partisan political battles that are often reduced to four-word slogans that we have with us still. Americans are asked to meet the challenge of the modern environmental movement, which takes photographs from outer space, from orbit of the planet as the icon, asking people to kind of forget those lines drawn by map makers on jigsaw puzzles denoting territory, but to think about the planet as a whole is a real challenge. This emergence of environmentalism and globalism of a new kind is a real challenge to notions of what the United States is. It's just at the beginning of the period when Americans are celebrating the nation's anniversary, the bicentennial in 1776, commemorated in 1976. And there's some really kind of stunning ways that Americans reckon with the change over time in the nation's history. This is a quilt by an African-American folk artist from Alabama, long before Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition or the Gay Pride flag, that imagines the nation differently, that imagines the nation as comprised of many more people and kinds and colors of people than the flag itself would seem to imagine to this artist. This is a weird image to put up on in this this presentation of otherwise fairly beautiful images. But this is, I want to claim to you, is a way that Americans think about themselves. This is the product of social scientific research over the course of the 20th century and the amassing of evidence, quantitative evidence that tells a people something about themselves. This also, of course, makes a historical argument. I just want to take a minute of it. I will just say, like, if you were in my U.S. history class, this would be your final exam. I always ask people just explain this slide. So good luck. Maybe someone has an explanation. But what we're looking at on the x-axis is the post-war era, right? So here's 45 down to our near present. And on the y-axis, we're measuring two different things. In red is House polarization. That is the political polarization of members of the House of Representatives. So between the end of the war and around 1972, people in the House, there was differences between the parties, and liberals were different for... But remember, this is the era when a lot of Republicans were liberals and a lot of Democrats were conservatives. So that there's not really party polarization, and even the distance between liberals and conservatives is not. That is to say, liberalism and conservatism haven't attached themselves to parties, nor has liberalism and conservatism themselves divided much. So it's an area of very low polarization, which has been on the rise ever since. We're like way up here now. And then the Gini index, which is a measure of income inequality, sometimes of wealth inequality, measuring the distance between the rich and the poor, very low in that same era, and then begins to rise right around that same time, and we're over here right now. So the final exam question is what's the relationship between these two curves, and what else would you put on this map that would explain them both if they don't explain each other? So submit your answers in the blue book. The internet, at least in the view of its early boosters, was meant to solve both of these problems. Wired magazine, which is the biggest, splashiest proponent of wiring the world, argued, including in this issue from 2000, that all political divisions, all national divisions, all ethnic and religious divisions would fade away once we were all connected to one another. Which usually gets a laugh, but you guys are too beaten down? I still find it funny. It's important to remember that even before social media, there was an enormous amount of criticism of this idea and suspicion of technological utopianism, and including a lot of skepticism about its origins and its political and economic origins. This just happens to be a beautiful artistic expression of that by the Korean-American artist named Jun Paik. You may have seen this at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. It's a giant neon sculpture that depicts the United States divided into these state lines that map makers would make into jigsaw puzzles, and each little each state has a whole series of television monitors in it that are blaring things. Like if you go by Oklahoma, you will not be surprised that you will hear, Oklahoma where the wind goes. What if you go by Massachusetts, you're going to hear, he's got the horse right here, his name is Paul Revere. But the thing that's tricky about it is, no matter how close you get or how far you move away from this magnificent piece of art, you really can't understand anything anyone is saying for more than like half a second. You can get like half a line of a song. But it's that everyone is broadcasting at top volume, making it impossible to listen to anyone. So the electronic superhighway, a very early indictment of the problems with the internet before iPhones, before Facebook. So I want to just remind you then that Americans have a long tradition of representation of the idea of America, over which we often fight and struggle and battle in ways that I think make a travesty of the nation's past and of the nation's contradictions. The Tea Party movement, of course, engaged in a battle of political symbols, claiming their movement to be the true heir of the American Revolution. We can think of all kinds of protests, including protests of Donald Trump's campaign pledge to build a wall. They call upon earlier forms of protest. Most of American politics looks both backward and forward. People often... I will make a confession. Up until 2016, when everyone would say, "You're a historian, tell me, is this unprecedented?" Like something bad would happen, and someone would say something. I'm trying to even remember what those things were. And I would say, "No, nothing's unprecedented." Like the wall, well, there used to be a thing about the wall. In the 19th centuries, there was going to be a wall. But since 2016, I've decided everything is unprecedented. So this was the last moment when I still believed. But I do want to suggest that there are forms of continuity in our graphic representations. Of course, this does look quite a bit like that political map of 1856. But I also want to suggest that there's something weird about a nation that pictures itself this way. I was giving a talk once in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is, if I can get, Portsmouth is like up here, right around here. And this woman said to me after the talk that she just got back from a canoeing trip that was super arduous. Like, it's just a really hard canoeing trip. You had to get up at like 4 in the morning. There were these long portages where you had to carry your canoe like over mountains. I mean, she was very self-heroizing. It was a great trip. But she was like, it was exhausting. It was 2 weeks. And she went, it was just with a tour, like random group of people. She went by herself. But she got to know the other 20 people on the tour, because you're sharing boats, you're carrying boats together. And they discovered over the course of the 2 weeks together that they all came from exactly the same line of, is it latitude that goes this way? Latitude? Like from Montana, like really literally within a degree. And they came to decide that's where the rugged people who would do these crazy canoe trips would come from. That they just lived in a kind of rugged place, and they had somewhat climatological similarities, and they had similar kind of leisure interests. And she said she felt such an incredibly profound kinship with her fellow country people, and she had never once in her life thought about the country in that way, or ever pictured it. And she still couldn't really picture it. They'd had to like draw like a map together to come to this understanding. So it really shook me up. I will say. And when we think about the partisan divisions of red state, blue state, and this is even before all the votes were in, this is just a projection, I think we would do well to kind of in some ways just reject that map and think about the nation differently and think about political community in different ways. And of course, what ties us all together, not all of us are Americans here, but as an American, I would say what ties us together is our commitment to a set of ideals. It still is a commitment to a set of ideals. And that commitment is a dishonest one unless we have a sense of all the ways in which we've failed to live up to those ideals, and unless that commitment involves learning from all of those failures and focusing on ways to remedy them. So I just want to say that at the time that I began writing this book, which was 2014, the year of Black Lives Matter, began as a movement, I was really moved by this last piece of art that I want to show you this evening by the African-American artist Glenn Ligon. It's one of a series of neon sculptures, neon and wire sculptures that he made called Double America. Ligon said that he was somewhat inspired by Charles Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And the series speaks to how it can be in the United States that what looks black to some people looks white to other people, how what looks right side up looks upside down to the other half of the population. And it's an extraordinarily difficult and unsettling and troubling way to live in a political community. But I think we would steer ourselves more clearly into a sense of agreement where agreement is necessary, or steer ourselves more honestly into disagreement when disagreement with respect is necessary, if we had a clearer sense of our own past. Thanks very much. I want to say two things. One is, after this event, I'll be signing books outside, but the other is that happily I spoke so fast that we have a lot of time for questions. And third, there's a mic going around, so raise your hand if you have a question, and then the mic can come to you.
Thank you for all your work. A little more on language. In Statesboro, Georgia, recently, a young Hispanic woman was reading from her novel, and she spoke in terms of white privilege. And afterwards, some of the students went outside and burned her books. And the words like white privilege and institutional racism and such as that, as a historian, as someone trying to help us understand these truths, these hard truths about our society, what guidelines do you set for yourself with regard to the use of language, and would you recommend for others of us to help what I think is an essentially ahistorical populace to understand their history better?
That is a really interesting question. I guess I would say I think about that maybe less as a writer where, you know, every word carries force for me, so sort of particularly like volatile words don't carry more force for me since I'm thinking, but I think about it a lot in the classroom. I would also say as a citizen, I myself don't devote attention and energy to struggles over language. I think symbolic politics are very low. They're just very low on my list of urgent matters. Most of my priorities have to do with public health, forms of income inequality. Like the language wars are not my wars as a citizen. As a teacher, as an instructor, I have ways that I work with my students in a classroom to set guidelines. And what I often do, and you know, I do this on the advice of friends who I admire who do similar things. Faculty talk about this stuff all the time, because you don't want someone to say something in a classroom that harms somebody, but you also don't want someone to say something in a classroom who didn't mean to harm somebody, feeling terrible about having harmed somebody. Like, there's all kinds of problems. So I, you know, in an environment like a classroom, I begin, or, you know, I used to do public speaking about the Tea Party, and people would, I swear to God, be at each other with baseball bats in the audience. So I did the same thing. I used to do the same thing when I prefaced public remarks during the volatile years of the Tea Party when I was out there. I wrote a book about the Tea Party called The Whites of Their Eyes that was largely about race. So it brought out a lot of hostility in people. Not to the level of book burning, to my knowledge. But I just generally say, look, let's begin with the assumption of goodwill. Like, let's begin with the assumption that all of us here are here to learn from one another, and if one of us says something that harms one another's feelings, let's assume it's not intentional. You can talk to me about it afterward, but I don't want you attacking each other. If you know, we can come to rules if there are concerns, but my first rule is the assumption of goodwill. Now, that's a classroom, that's a particular kind of environment. I think when you ask people to rise to the occasion of speaking with care toward one another, they generally do. Yeah, I do believe that.
You mentioned that you started this book in 2014 and that 2016 was unprecedented. So my question is, did you feel like you had to make a hard right after 2016, or was this something that was already in the making that you didn't have to shift away from in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, no, I didn't make a hard right. Like, what happened in history happened in history. Like, what happened in 1841 still happened regardless of who won the election of 2016. You know what I mean? Like, we are so used to people using history to make ideological claims that you would imagine that you'd have to rewrite it to kind of explain the present. But the book isn't an explanation of the present. The book is an exploration of the past, right? So weirdly, so I was well past halfway through the book, and when I this gets to the question about the title. For a long time, I wanted to call the book American History from Beginning to End because it just had a kind of, I thought that was funny. I don't know why I thought that was funny. Like that, it was like as if it was an encyclopedia or a storybook. And it was it was always gonna begin in 1492 with the beginning of that as a beginning date as a problem, not like as like, oh, history begins, American history begins, because it doesn't. But a problem about where history begins in when what becomes the United States begins in 1492. And then it was always going to end on Inauguration Day in 2009, which is a great ending, because no matter whether you voted for Barack Obama or didn't vote for Barack Obama or approved of his presidency or didn't approve of it, this is an extraordinary landmark in American history. And also, dramatic, beautiful moment. The inauguration was gorgeous. It's just like, ta-da! The end. And I thought that was kind of funny. And it just made sense. Like, you could just thematically, you could imagine throwing all these balls in the air that were all going to somehow land. It would feel like they landed. And I'd written the book with that in mind, to the degree that I had an ending I was writing toward. It was that ending. And I was well past half done when Trump was elected. I will say historians hate writing about the near present. I do write about the near present. I write even about the present as a journalist, but as a historian, you're really not supposed to. So 2009 felt comfortably in the past to me, but when Trump won in November of 2016, I had to change my plans because there was a political revolution. People came out and voted for him who hadn't voted before. People switched parties to vote for him. People who had voted for Obama voted for him, even though he had been this incredible provocateur of the Obama administration. So it's fascinating, and it seemed like it'd betray Trump supporters to not cover the election, like what you just wrote a history book and somehow Trump never got elected in it. That would really seem like a storybook, like it just didn't make any sense. So I had to add the Obama administration's 2 terms, and then I had to try to offer some explanation of an unanticipated electoral result. So I added that stuff in the end, but no, it doesn't actually, I didn't require any changes earlier on, because the same country that voted for Obama in 2012, 4 years later, voted for Trump. It's not a different country. It doesn't have a different history.
Doctor, I'm glad I didn't have to take your final exam, but if I did...
Oh, you have an explanation?
Yeah,
Let's hear it.
No, I don't, but I do have a question. I noticed that as you showed the graph, that there were points in time where it did have a negative slope. And what would it take, because you reported to us that the slope is even higher and steeper today in both lines, what positive things would have to take place for that slope to begin to turn back down?
That's a great question. That could be the extra credit question. Okay, so what I would point out are a few things about when it was low as a way to begin to answer that question. So did people want to shout out their theory about why it's low, why either of these lines are so low before 1970? Post-war prosperity. What else? Trade unions. That's an excellent idea, yeah.
High taxes on the rich.
High taxes on the rich.
Great society programs.
Sort of, yeah. Okay, you could talk about this as a Great Society program intervention, I suppose. Okay, I would add to that. That's a very good working list. It's a very informed classroom here. The GI Bill. The GI Bill is still in effect here. Like, my dad First person in my family born in the United States, his middle name's Amerigo. For that reason, we're from Italy. We're the last Italians over before they shut the door. And served in World War II. First person in his family to go to college. First person in his family to buy a house. Like, the GI Bill was a complete social welfare state for white men. Black men almost entirely excluded from its benefits for reasons I discuss in the book. So you get this social welfare state that makes possible an American middle class, and also is an engine of prosperity, an incredible engine of abundance, but is tied as well to very, very high, I think it's 91% tax rate during the Eisenhower years and here. So the other thing you might, we're all only so far talking about income inequality or the Gini index. Does anyone have any explanation for the polarization being so low? Aside from that, people are very middle class. Yeah. All right, that's the main reason you might say. But another explanation that has been put forward by a really interesting political scientist from Princeton, this is an intuitive argument. I'm sorry, I'm giving you a lecture. I'm giving you like a whole other lecture. I'll do this really briefly, I promise. It's an intuitive argument, but it's he demonstrates it quantitatively, which is that this is the era of broadcast news. Up until 75, this is when people start getting remote controls. And what he argues is polarization is low during these years because at 6 o'clock, everybody comes home from work and puts on the television, but the only thing on is CBS News, ABC News, or NBC News. And so even if you're not interested in politics, you watch the news. And his argument is, and his evidence is, that means that people who don't follow politics vote. Who are people who don't follow politics? We call them swing voters, or earlier generations called them moderates. So during these years, because everybody's watching the news because there's nothing else going on television, a lot of people who don't care about politics and therefore are completely apartisan vote, which makes politics less volatile. I mean, this prosperity has a big role too. So then he argues once you get cable news, cable television, and at 6 o'clock you could watch reruns of Gilligan's Island or reruns of The Family Feud or World Wrestling Federation, all the people that don't care about politics stop voting. They fall out of the electorate, which makes the existing electorate much more polarized. And then by the time you get to 1987, the Reagan administration abolishes the Fairness Doctrine. And by the late 80s, you have, in the wake of the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine, you have Rush Limbaugh and a new conservative media, gains a huge market share. And then you have, by the time we get to the 90s, you have Fox News and MSNBC, and we're off and running. Let's not keep looking at that, though.
Okay, so thank you very much for this great talk. I wondered at which point Native Americans disappeared in your story, because they played a very prominent role in the early phase, and then sometime in the 19th century, they didn't really seem to be so important. But of course, settler colonialism is not past, it's still ongoing. And so I wonder what you could say about the possibility of this narrative of, like coming to a better understanding of each other in a context where Native people are struggling for sovereignty, and many white people are not willing to address the fact that settler colonialism is ongoing. So how does that, is in that framework, is it even possible to enter into a dialogue that will make it possible to a certain, what the truth is and how sort of a joint idea of America could be articulated?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. It's absolutely central throughout the story. I began my work as a scholar working on the relationships between colonial New Englanders and the indigenous peoples of what came to be called New England. It's an area of my early expertise and an ongoing interest, and of course, exactly as you say, continues to be an urgent political matter in the United States and in other parts of the world. I think it is, when you write a 1,000-page book that covers centuries, any person or group can find deficiencies in the account and matters of emphasis with which they disagree. After the hardcover edition of my book appeared, I don't read reviews, but a former student of mine to whom I'd given a very bad grade wrote a review of the book in which she claimed that Native peoples disappeared from the book. She made the argument you just made in a review. I didn't read the review, but I asked someone to summarize it to me, and I thought there were some good points in it. I think it was unethical for a former student to review her professor's work, but that's a separate question. The ethics of reviewing is another whole other lecture. But I took it really seriously, that in the interest of driving my narrative forward and covering what I needed to do with the United States' role in the larger world, that maybe I had lost that thread. And so I spent a lot of time revising the book for the paperback edition, which the German edition is based on, spending time finding moments in the narrative where it did make sense to draw the reader's attention to the very different path that indigenous rights movements have taken from, say, the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement is generally arguing for full, in American has been arguing for full and equal civil rights, whereas indigenous peoples sometimes have argued for full civil rights within the American nation state, but have much more often argued for sovereignty and argued for their own nations, their native nationhood to be recognized. So that in instances, for instance, in the 1920s, where the federal government pledged to de facto make all Native peoples citizens, many Native people said, that's exactly what we don't want. That FDR's Indian New Deal also was a kind of quid pro quo for Native peoples who agreed to become citizens in exchange for giving up certain other rights and claims of sovereignty. That has been an ongoing story in the 20th century. I also wrote a little book earlier this year called This America that's quite squarely about the history of nationalism and places struggles for Native nationhood at its very center. My favorite thing that I came across in doing that work, where I corresponded with colleagues of mine who are Native American history specialists, was a story about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When the United States entered NATO, the Hopi people sent a memo to the federal government and said, we noticed that you people have entered this alliance where you'll come to the defense of anyone else in your new alliance. We just want to be clear, we are the Hopi. We don't join your alliance. We are not going to be defending Germany in a war. We're not. So I have tried to address that more fully in subsequent editions of the book.
Thank you for your talk. I find one of the points of your scholarship so interesting in the way that you look at the toxic effect on current politics of a lack of historical awareness, and how that seems to be a particularly American disease, and yet you can find it in a lot of other cultures. I was wondering if in the context of that you had done any sort of comparative work in terms of best practices, and whether you had looked at all at how it's, for example, done in Germany.
No, I haven't. There are a lot of people involved in the United States, and I think trying to do that work. And one thing they would say, and with which I would agree, is that we don't have a tradition in the United States of a kind of truth and reconciliation, of any real formal public reckoning with the atrocity of slavery and conquest, with the atrocity of Jim Crow segregation. We have, in many ways, I think, among the reasons that reckoning has never come is that those things are not over. If the Holocaust were in our past and it ended at a certain year, there'd be trials and there'd be, we don't have that. We still have race-based voter suppression. We still have race-based violence. We still have racial incitement. So when does the reckoning come? I'm not sure where we look for that model.
Could you say perhaps something about gerrymandering? I suppose legislatures all over the world have to draw maps in order to allocate voters, but at least to us over here, it seems to be that only in America you come up with these very bizarre maps, which probably make impossible jigsaw puzzles. And now that also the Supreme Court has said that they can't do anything about it, I wonder why it's so hard to correct what's going on there in the name of the ideals you wrote your book about.
Yeah. It's embarrassing, the gerrymandering maps. I think the reason it's hard to do something about it is the reason that you probably have in mind, which is that there are moneyed and political interests that would like to continue it, and they have been very successful. And I think its dangers, though, I think are easy to underestimate. Political scientists have done some really interesting quantitative research to suggest that as gerrymandering, as bad as it is not having the scale of effects that many people who are opposed to it think. It just doesn't have, it's not as bad for elections as you would think it is. I haven't done this research, I just report that. But I think that misses maybe what it really is bad for, which is any notion of a political community. The cynicism of splitting up communities in this way for the sake of achieving a narrow short-term electoral victory is a manifestation of a kind of abdication of lowercase republicanism. I mean, living, that is to say, with other people, with a sense of a shared public life. That's, to me, in some ways, a much deeper and more worrisome problem. I can imagine fixing gerrymandering. I don't know how you fix the loss of commitment to a shared public life, to a common weal.
You mentioned talking about 2016 as unprecedented, and I was wondering if you were serious or were joking, and if it does feel unprecedented, you know, having just written the history of the U.S., what about the current moment feels unprecedented?
Yeah, I mean, partly I was just joking. Also, I'm just tired. I think one reason that I always have insisted for so long when asked, so this book came out last year in the U.S., and I did a lot of talks like this. And I came to see that before the end of the evening, every evening, because I like doing the Q&A, I would always do a lot of it. But every evening before the end of it, there would be 3 questions that would always, it's like a religious something, like the 3 questions would always be asked before the sun set. Has it ever been this bad? Who can we blame? And can you save us? And I was fascinated by that. And I developed some sort of stock answers, which I've now forgotten, to each of these questions, because they don't thankfully come up here. But has it ever been this bad? I always used as an opportunity to say, for whom? African Americans could not reliably vote in the United States until 1965. When we want to talk about political polarization and the distance between the parties, it is important analytically to recognize that there is no stronger political party in the sense of a people with a shared political agenda than people who are held in bondage. The population that is enslaved, which is 4 million people by the Civil War, operates in American history as if you understand that as a political party, an utterly powerless political party, and a completely suppressed political party. Then what's the distance between the Democrats and the Republicans? Nothing. They're all free. That is an extraordinarily polarized politics. Or the era of Jim Crow segregation, people who are completely unable to vote, who are subject to discrimination in housing and employment, in education. They form a political party, a shadow political party, a disempowered political party. But if we think about that, then the sort of, oh, American politics is so polarized. Well, no, it's actually not. Relative to a time when, this third of the 15% of the population is completely disenfranchised, and therefore outside of the realm of even belonging to a poll, this is harmonious. And I think that's important to say. And that kind of, has it ever been this bad? Like, there is no day under slavery that is not a worse day for everybody. contaminated by that system. So this is, I know I feel like I'm giving you a harangue, but like this, it kind of drove me nuts that people say, has it ever been this bad? Is this so unprecedented? Well, no, actually, this is what pluralism, this is the challenge of pluralism. When everyone can vote, it's a mess. And that's okay. So I stick with that line, but then I also, in working on the book, came up with this other argument about the last chapter runs from 9/11, 2001, until Election Day 2016. And in it, I argue that the political divisions that had been very carefully cultivated by partisans in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, in those years, by 2001 to 2016, had become automated. And it's very difficult to dismantle an automated polarizing machine. And that's the bind that seems to me to be unprecedented.
Do you have an explanation for the fact that America only has 2 political parties?
Well, as I just said, I think it has always had more than 2. And we need to, I think analytically, our understanding of history would be enriched by thinking about disenfranchised people as a shadow political party. I wrote a book early in my career called New York Burning about the emergence of the 2-party system in the colonies in New York, which argues that the toleration for a non-court party, that is, the toleration for any kind of an opposition party in American history, rests in the existence of essentially a de facto political party of people who are enslaved, whose distance politically from all people who are free makes the 2-party system possible. So I have a kind of whole historical analysis about that that is kind of inseparable from the history of race and slavery and segregation. And maybe too long of a lecture for this weary audience.
So you showed us some beautiful images and gave us a beautiful account of both trends of illiberalism and trends of liberalism, trends of progressivism, trends of reaction and hierarchy. I'm wondering at the end of the day, and I can already guess maybe what your answer is going to be, so I'm going to preempt it, but at the end of the day, which is the dominant trend in American political history? Now, I imagine you're going to say, well, both are there. But come on, which is the dominant? Which do you put faith in at the end of the day as winning? I mean, this is a history from beginning to end. So who wins in the end?
Historians, we take a blood oath not to answer questions like that. When you get your PhD, you just slash your hand, you sign in the book. I don't have an answer for you. Who wins between liberal modernity and illiberal modernity? I do think that they, as I wrote in this very short book, This America, which is a history of nationalism, both liberal and illiberal, they are engaged in a kind of Manichaean battle with each other, both here and around the world. And what I argue in that book, which you will find unsatisfying because it doesn't exactly answer your question, but is an argument, is that the reasons that a kind of liberal vision of the nation are often overtaken by an illiberal vision of the nation in our day is that liberals hate talking about nations. Since the Second World War, liberals have hated talking about nations. They wanted to talk about places like this with their globalism and their cosmopolitanism and their internationalism, and they hoped for a new and better and more global world in which nationalism would die out and the nation state would eventually disappear, and we would live in that beautiful Earth scene from Apollo. And it turns out that although that may one day happen, because nation states are a fiction, we agree to live in nation states, it hasn't happened yet. And meanwhile, people live in nation states, and people who live in nation states need accounts of their past. And if the only people who are willing to provide accounts of a national past are illiberal nationalists, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, thanks for these beautiful pictures. You are here in Berlin in a rather secular or atheist or neo-pagan or whatever city.
Did you say
whatever you want to
neo-pagan?
call this. So that
All the neo-pagans, right?
so that I'm asking, the most astonishing thing for many Europeans is this religion in the United States, and I haven't seen any picture about what this crusade, reborn Christian, and what happens to all these kinds of in God we trust. Everybody pays cash, which we get from America.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's actually an interesting oversight. I should probably add an image, although I would say that maybe that that picture of progress that I showed, the sort of angelic picture, has itself a kind of particular Christian feel to it, to me. It is a really important question, and I think that I would say first that the evangelical Christian tradition in the United States has not generally been a conservative political tradition. It has largely been a radical political tradition. So I spend a lot of time with black abolitionists in the 1820s and 1830s who call upon the nation to realize the Christian promise of the Declaration of Independence, who do not treat it as a secular document, as in fact it was written, but read Jefferson's invocation of equality, read into it a Christian notion of equality before the eyes of God, which extends to all people, black and white, male and female. And that evangelical radicalism in what in the United States is called the Second Great Awakening is crucial to the transformation of the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. And we could think of course, the Civil Rights Movement is a Christian moral crusade and is usefully understood as such. So while when people, I think especially in Europe, talk about Christianity in the United States, they're thinking kind of Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority in 1979 forward. They're thinking of the New Right that emerges in the late 1970s and is very much a vehicle for the modern conservative movement, and of course remains politically quite strong. Even though a lot of people thought the Christian right died in 1999, a lot of people turned out to have been wrong. So, well, just to say, I think the question of the role, the political role that evangelical Christianity and later fundamentalism has played in American politics is far more complicated than maybe it seems, especially if you're only thinking about the recent past. Fundamentalists in particular were opposed to Darwinism, but they were really opposed to social Darwinism. So I think there's some important correctives that involve thinking a little bit more carefully about when and where Christian activists enter American life. But the way in which I think it's important in a structural way to think about Christianity, there are two places. And I'm sorry, I'm giving you another lecture. I'm going to try to do this briefly. One is because so many people who lived in the United States were denied the right to vote for so long, they perfected a political style that is the moral crusade. That is to say, they couldn't vote, but what they could do was crusade morally. And they could crusade with the force of their Christian faith. And that is a really important part of American politics and has been from the 18-teens, from the 1820s. It's what the pro-life movement is. The Me Too movement is a moral crusade. Americans really love moral crusades. McCarthyism was a moral crusade against communism. It's a political style that Americans love, and they developed because they suppressed the political rights of so many people for so long. Secondly, there's something really important about how Americans read their Constitution and its relationship to how evangelical Protestants read the Bible. There's a really interesting study done once about what a legal scholar said, well, what if you could do a perfect scientific experiment, and you could have one group of people that are whose laws are descended from the laws of England, who have a mixed constitution and a written constitution, and become the United States, and then you could have some control groups that are people from England, whose laws are descended from England, that have a written constitution. Oh, we have that. We have Australia and Canada. And so did this whole study comparing these three political communities. And in the United States, there's a tradition that's dominant now in American jurisprudence of reading the Constitution as if it were written by God. And Christians study the Constitution in Bible study groups. They study it devotionally in that same way. And that doesn't happen. Like, I met a guy in Canada who helped write their constitution once, and he was like, yeah, nobody thinks I'm God. So there's just a weirdness. It can make our politics really brittle. Because if your founding documents are divinely inspired, or if some large segment of the population believes them to be, then when you disagree with those people, you're not disagreeing in a civil sense. You're committing blasphemy. And that's a weird tension in American political discourse. Maybe can we get this guy in front who's been waiting for a while?
Thanks a lot. Speaking as a German, not an American, but having a sister living over there, being an American citizen, so perhaps I can talk in her name as well. My question when comparing the rise and fall of superpowers, because actually you're depicting to a certain degree the rise of the United States becoming a superpower from the end of the Second World War, or prior even, and after the Second World War especially. And when you connect it especially to the giving up the abolishment of the gold standard in the 70s after the loss of the Vietnam War, probably in a way interconnected. Does the superpower or becoming superpower require one wars in order to have something to distribute, to give everyone a pursuit of happiness notion? Is this perhaps a message that could be drawn or derived from the historian side of the the story?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, there is a moment at the time of the end of the Cold War, when the conservative movement that has been trying since the 1950s to take power has finally got the White House with Reagan, and is having extraordinary success taking over the courts, putting conservative judges on federal courts, and has founded an alternative press, found the founding of Fox News right around that same time, that I forget who this exchange is between. I think I write about it in the book, where there's this conversation where there's sort of sense of, oh, well, we don't have an enemy anymore. The Cold War is over. And this leading conservative says, no, the Cold War has only begun because finally our real enemy can be liberals. And that actually is what happens. Right, there's even for all the polarization, the widening polarization during the Cold War, there is still a sense that the United States has a common enemy. You can draw a very unsettling line from that moment to now. I mean, then the question is, like, does the war on terror, the kind of whooped up war on terror after 9/11, it doesn't replace the Cold War as that war. It just becomes a more polarizing war. Maybe we have time for one last question. Yeah, I mean, I don't have. You know who's been holding their hands up?
So I'm not going to ask you to save us, but I've just been stuck on one thing, and you might have answered it. So I was thinking, because you were talking about Baek Nam-jun, the Korean artist, and I realized when you said Korean-American artist, I had never thought of him as a Korean-American artist. I thought of him as a Korean artist. Mm-hmm. And that question did bring back to your whole lecture, really, because, I think he was actually American on paper, but Korea so claimed him, and of course he spent, his chief career was here in Germany. So I guess America is really on paper in my mind. And then you talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, Oriental Exclusion Act, and at the same time, the Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty, Ellis Island happening. So who gets to be, I guess that's maybe a larger question, who gets to be American? Because there's such a hypocrisy between what is and what's not allowed to be American, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, apologies if you feel that I misrepresented. I'm not an art historian. I try to choose images that show a range of change over time, and that also a lot of different kinds of people. That question is a really important one throughout American history, and as this earlier question suggested, there are plenty of people living in the United States who want to insist that they're not American. I mean, the indigenous sovereignty movement is its own kind of separate trajectory, but for immigrants to the United States, the claim of being American it's not granted. It's something that has to be fought for. And what the fight is even about changes over time. There's not one single fight. There are, it's a big thing, say, in the 1840s when the Irish want American citizenship, but they don't want to send their kids to public schools. They want to send their kids to Irish Catholic schools. And there's a kind of claim on the, on the part of there's a Horace Mann and public educators who say, no, that's not a way to be an American. You either join our public schools or you're not part of our civic body. So I don't think there's, and different ethnic groups or different immigrant groups over time have had different priorities and different desires and have made different claims. But I think all of that, in fact, is what makes up the United States. In many ways, it is the clamor over what it means to be an American that is what it means to be an American. And it is America's best idea that anyone who's willing to enter the fray and argue about that because they care about it and they care about those ideas is an American. Thanks very much.